In the wet gray autumn of 1987, 26-year-old Wren Collier inherited the silence of her grandfather's 160 acres of spent wheatland outside Prairie, Manitoba. She inherited the warped screen door that slapped in every wind off the prairie, the rusting Massey Ferguson that leaked hydraulic fluid onto the cracked concrete of the old machine shed, and the particular kind of exhaustion that belongs to land that has been farmed the same wrong way for 40 years. But most of all, she inherited his notebooks. 3 of them, brown cover, water-stained, filled from margin to margin in his cramped, left-handed scrawl. Not the financial records a man is supposed to keep, but the quiet private wonderings of someone who had spent his whole life watching the same square mile of earth and never quite stopped being puzzled by it. Her grandfather, Thomas Collier, had been a stubborn man in every direction, stubborn about his opinions, stubborn about his coffee, and especially stubborn about a half-formed idea he'd carried for the last decade of his life, but never acted upon. He was 81 years old when his heart quit, and he had spent his final years less on the tractor and more walking the shelter belts and the low corners of the fields where the water pooled after spring thaw. Wren had walked with him during those last summers, back when she was still in her teens. And the farm was the place she went to escape the noise of Winnipeg. He would crouch at the edge of the slough in the northwest quarter and hold a handful of that dark, wet margin soil up to the light. "Smell that," he'd say, and she would. It smelled alive, dark and complicated and faintly sweet, like something growing beneath the surface. Then he would walk 20 feet to the dry, open field and pick up a handful of the pale, worked-over topsoil. "Now smell this one." It smelled of nothing, like chalk, like surrender. He never explained the comparison to her. He just nodded slowly and moved on. After the funeral, after the relatives had eaten and driven back to their separate cities, Wren sat alone in the farmhouse kitchen with those 3 notebooks and a pot of tea that went cold before she touched it. She read until 2 in the morning. What she found was not a plan. It was more like a suspicion that had never found its conclusion. He had written about the slough repeatedly, about the richness of its margin, about the way the cattails grew thick and green where the field drained into it, about the populations of red-winged blackbirds that nested there and dropped their waste into the shallow water. He had written, in 1981, a single sentence that she read 3 times before she understood what he meant. The slough feeds the edge, and the edge feeds nothing, because the edge feeds nothing back. She sat with that sentence for a long time. The men at the Portage Co-op, the ones who had known her grandfather, and now watched her with the polite skepticism reserved for young women who inherit farms, instead of selling them, had a clear answer for her situation. The soil was depleted. 40 years of monoculture wheat had stripped it. The answer was synthetic nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, applied on schedule, by the numbers, worked back into the ground with the seed. It was the same answer they gave everyone. It worked after a fashion. The yields were acceptable. The costs were significant. The debt was structural and permanent, like the mortgage on a house you could never quite pay off. Her grandfather had done it this way for 20 years, and in the last decade, he had begun to hate himself for it. She could see the self-recrimination in the notebooks. Fed the ground poison again. No choice, they say. Always no choice. Wren spent the first winter on the farm reading everything she could find. She drove to the University of Manitoba Library and asked a librarian for help locating papers on soil microbiology, on wetland ecology, on the nitrogen cycle in natural systems. The librarian, a patient woman named Judith who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, helped her pull 3 years' worth of journals from the agricultural science stacks without asking a single unnecessary question. Wren read them at the kitchen table with a dictionary beside her, working through the vocabulary of a discipline she had never studied. She was trained as a school teacher. She had a year of science at university and a thorough first-hand knowledge of what it meant to explain a complicated thing simply. That combination turned out to be more useful than she expected. What she learned, in the cold shorthand of academic papers, confirmed what her grandfather had sensed without being able to articulate. A healthy soil is not a medium. It is a community. It requires organic matter, microbial populations, the slow cycling of nutrients through living things. What her grandfather's fields had, after 4 decades of tillage and synthetic inputs, was a chemistry problem, pretending to be a farming system. The fertilizer produced plants. The plants were harvested. Nothing came back. The soil grew poorer each year, and the only response was more fertilizer, which addressed the symptom and deepened the disease. Now, here is where the notebooks became something more than a record. On the second-to-last page of the 3rd notebook, her grandfather had made a sketch. It was crude. He was no draftsman, but unmistakable. A slough, represented by a rough oval, arrows showing water flowing out from the slough and across a field. Alongside the slough, a symbol that took Wren a moment to identify. Fish, small, simple fish shapes, the kind a child draws, and beneath the sketch, in his cramped hand, a question he had never answered. If the slough feeds the margin, what feeds the slough? She stared at that page until she heard the furnace click on in the basement. Then she drove to a bait and tackle shop in Prairie, where a man named Mr. LeBlanc, who smelled of lake water and pipe tobacco, sold her 50 pounds of pearl millet seed, and listened with genuine interest while she explained what she wanted to try. He knew someone, he said, a friend who ran a small aquaculture operation near Winnipeg Beach. They raised fathead minnows for bait, but they also had a tank of grass carp they'd been trying to move. Grass carp, Mr. LeBlanc explained, are not glamorous fish. They are functional fish. They consume aquatic vegetation at a remarkable rate. Their waste is nitrogen-rich, and they tolerate cold water far better than tilapia. They were also, he added, technically illegal for release into Manitoba waterways, which meant she would need to be thoughtful about containment. She assured him she would be. The slough was landlocked, its outlet a shallow drainage ditch that had not run water in 8 dry years. She could screen it. In April, when the ice came off the slough and the red-winged blackbirds returned to the cattails, Wren Collier did something that ensured her reputation in Portage-la-Prairie for years to come. She backed her grandfather's half-ton to the edge of the slough and released 60 grass carp into it. Not fingerlings, juveniles, each one 6 to 8 inches long. They vanished into the dark water with a series of quiet splashes, and then there was nothing to see. Just the slough, the same as it had always been, and a young woman standing at the edge of it in rubber boots, looking satisfied. Her nearest neighbor, a man named Mr. Prentice, and had farmed it the same way since 1964, happened to be checking his fence line that morning. He stopped his truck on the grid road and rolled down the window. He was not an unkind man. He had come to her grandfather's funeral and shaken her hand and meant it. But he was looking at her the way a person looks at someone who has just made a decision that cannot be undone. "What are you putting in that slough, Wren?" "Grass carp, Mr. Prentice." A silence. The wind moved through the dried cattails with a papery sound. "What in God's name for?" "Nitrogen," she said. Mr. Prentice pulled the greasy brim of his cap down an inch, which was his version of shaking his head. He rolled the window back up and drove on. By the end of that week, she had been mentioned at the co-op, at Smitty's on Saskatchewan Avenue, and at the Thursday morning coffee that the retired farmers held at the back of the farm supply store. The word used most commonly was eccentric. The word used less commonly, but more honestly, was gone. As in, that girl is gone. Let me stop here for a moment, because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever had a conviction so clear and so private that you couldn't give it away even to someone who asked in good faith? Not stubbornness, something quieter than that, something that feels less like an opinion you hold and more like a truth you've agreed to carry until it proves itself. That is what Wren had in the spring of 1988, standing at the edge of a landlocked Manitoba slough with 60 borrowed fish in it and every person she knew waiting at a comfortable distance for her to fail. The official concern arrived in June in the form of Mr. Hargreaves, a soils extension officer from the Provincial Agriculture Department, who drove a green government pickup and wore the particular expression of a man whose job required him to gently redirect people who had made agricultural decisions unsupported by provincial recommendations. He was not dismissive. He was worse than dismissive. He was thorough. He walked the perimeter of the slough with her, noting the grass carp, noting the screening at the outlet ditch, taking a water sample in a small plastic bottle that he labeled with a felt pen. He asked about her yield targets, about her fertilizer plan, about her crop insurance. Then he said, in the tone of a man who has given this speech before, "Miss Collier, I understand you're exploring alternative inputs, and I respect that, but your grandfather's soil records show organic matter at less than 1%. You are planting wheat into what is essentially a depleted mineral substrate. These fish," he gestured toward the slough with the capped water bottle, "can produce some localized benefit to the immediate margin, but the notion that biological activity in a surface water feature can meaningfully replace nitrogen inputs across a 160-acre operation, I'm afraid the numbers simply don't support it." "My grandfather believed the soil had memory," Wren said. Mr. Hargreaves considered this. "Soil science has come a long way since." "I know," she said, "but I'm not talking about chemistry. I'm talking about biology." He made several notes on his clipboard. He thanked her for her time. He mailed her a package of literature from the provincial agronomy program, which she read carefully and found useful in ways he had not intended. He would later reference her operation at a regional meeting as an example of the challenges of knowledge transfer to non-traditional farm operators. She was not there, but her cousin was, and told her about it later. The second antagonist arrived in September, just before harvest. His name was Mr. Doyle, and he wore a company jacket with the logo of a major fertilizer distributor stitched above the pocket. He was perhaps 45, very comfortable, the kind of man who has converted his ease into a sales technique. He parked in her yard and came to the door as if he were visiting a friend. He offered her a deal: first-year credit on a full input package, no payment until after harvest. He'd seen her file at the co-op, he said, meaning he'd looked at her grandfather's purchase history and noticed the absence of her name on any invoice. He understood she was trying something different. He respected the impulse. But the window for fall fertilizer application was closing, and if she wanted a viable crop next year, she needed to make a decision. "You're a bright woman," he said, which was the moment she understood he had decided she was not. "You don't want to gamble your grandfather's land on a pond of fish." Wren looked past him at the slough, which was catching the afternoon light in a way that made the water look almost amber. The grass carp had done their work over the summer. The overgrowth of aquatic vegetation that had choked these sloughs for years was cleared. The water moved differently now, not stagnant, but circulating in a slow, self-generated current driven by the feeding activity of the fish. She had also, in late May, installed a small solar-powered aerator she'd found second-hand in a farm auction near Traherne. It ran 12 hours a day and cost her nothing after installation. The water in the slough smelled different than it had in spring. Cleaner, earthier, like the margin soil her grandfather had held up to the light. "I appreciate you coming out, Mr. Doyle," she said. "I don't need the product, but thank you." His friendliness cooled, the way a gas flame drops when you reduce the pressure. "Miss Collier, with respect, the system you're describing doesn't scale. It doesn't hold up to agronomic scrutiny. When your numbers come in below your neighbors in August, I hope you'll remember this conversation." "I will," she said. She meant it differently than he did. Now, let me explain what was actually happening in that slough, because I think it matters, and the story doesn't make sense without it. Grass carp are feeding machines. They consume aquatic vegetation, cattails, pondweed, algae, at a rate that can clear a shallow water body in a single season. As they feed and move and breathe, they excrete ammonia directly into the water. In an aerated, circulating water body, that ammonia does not accumulate to toxic levels. Instead, it is processed by naturally occurring nitrifying bacteria, first into nitrite, then into nitrate, in the same stepwise biological process that has operated in healthy freshwater systems for millions of years. Nitrate is plant-available nitrogen. It is, in fact, the same nitrogen that a bag of synthetic fertilizer delivers, but produced by living organisms in a form that includes phosphorus, trace minerals, dissolved organic carbon, and the full complement of microbial byproducts that synthetic inputs do not. When Wren opened her irrigation gates to bring water off the slough and onto her fields, which she did slowly by gravity through shallow furrows she'd hand-dug along the field margins, she was not just watering her crop. She was delivering a dilute, continuous, biologically complete nutrient solution directly to the Sciencemonde surface. It was not an input source. It was a nutrient factory. Her grandfather had stood at its edge for 30 years and felt the rightness of it without being able to name what he felt, but the knowledge had a cost, and the cost was time. The first 2 years were an education in patience that no one had offered to teach her. She learned to read the water the way her grandfather had read the soil, by color, by smell, by the populations of organisms visible on the surface and below it. She learned to manage the fish population by netting out adults and selling them to a specialty Asian grocery in Winnipeg at $12 a fish, which covered the electricity for the aerator and left a small surplus. She learned to monitor the pH of the slough water with a test kit from the aquarium supply store and to adjust it with agricultural lime when the biological activity began to acidify the system. She made mistakes and corrected them without any help from anyone. There was a Thursday in August of the second summer, a dry Thursday, the kind that Manitoba specializes in, heat pressing down from a white sky, when she stood on the back step of the farmhouse and looked at her wheat. It was greener than she'd expected, but thinner than she'd hoped. 3/4 of a mile to the east, Mr. Prentice's wheat was a different kind of green, heavier, more uniform, pushed up by inputs and the confidence of an established system. The difference was visible, and she didn't pretend otherwise, not even to herself. That evening she called her mother in Winnipeg, but because she needed to hear a voice that remembered Thomas Collier as a man and not just a file at the co-op, her mother said, "He used to say the land keeps the score," and Wren thought about that for a long time after she hung up. She went back inside, opened the third notebook to the sketch of the slough and the fish and the arrows, and read his question again. If the slough feeds the margin, what feeds the slough? She had answered that question. She had put 60 fish in it. She had added the aerator. She had dug the furrows. She had been patient. She closed the notebook. She went back out in the morning. The third year, earthworms appeared in the margin soil where the irrigation furrows ran. Not one or two, handfuls of them, deep reddish pink, twisting in the disturbed earth when she turned it with her boot. She knelt down and held one in her palm, the way her grandfather had held the dark margin soil, and she felt, for the first time, that something irreversible had begun. She sent a soil core sample from the margin area to a provincial lab under her grandfather's name, half out of sentiment and half because she wasn't sure she wanted her own name on any report that might draw further attention from Mr. Hargreaves. The results came back 6 weeks later. Organic matter in the margin soil, 2.1%, up from a baseline of 0.8 when she'd taken the first sample herself 2 years prior. Microbial biomass, elevated significantly. Available nitrogen, adequate. The report described the sample as showing signs of active biological recovery. She read it 3 times. The 4th year, the margin where the slough water had run continuously for 3 growing seasons began to yield differently from the rest of the field. Not dramatically. Nothing Wren did was dramatic, but measurably. The plants were darker green, taller at the crown, and they produced more heads per square foot than the adjacent untreated area. When she harvested, she weighed the sections separately. The margin yielded 18% more wheat per acre than the untreated field, with no synthetic fertilizer applied. None. The adjacent section, managed identically except for the slough water, yielded what the field had always yielded. The comparison was clean, and it was hers, and she put the numbers in a new notebook she had started the day she moved to the farm and planned to continue for as long as she farmed it. The 5th year brought a drought. July and August were the driest in Manitoba in 11 years. Mr. Prentice's operation ran his irrigation pumps 18 hours a day and still lost 20% of his yield to the heat stress. 3 other operators in the municipality filed crop insurance claims. Wren's field, the margin that the slough water had fed for 4 years, held moisture in a way the surrounding soil did not. The organic matter that had rebuilt itself there acted the way her grandfather's dark slough-edged soil had always acted, as a sponge, retaining water at depth, releasing it slowly at the root zone. Her plants did not thrive in the drought, but they did not fail. She made her numbers. The autumn following that dry summer, the yields were posted at the grain elevator on Crescent Road. Wren Collier, 42 bushels per acre on the treated margin in a drought year. The municipality average was 31. The whisper that moved through the co-op coffee group that week was not laughter. It was the specific quiet of people revising an opinion they had held with some confidence. It was 2 years after that harvest, 6 years after she had first released the grass carp into the Slough, that Mr. Doyle's company car appeared at the end of her lane again. He was different this time. Not obviously so, he still wore the jacket, but there was less ease in him, the way a chair looks smaller when you take the cushion off. The fertilizer market had shifted. Input costs were climbing. Farmers in the region were asking questions they had not asked before about soil health and long-term productivity. His district manager had sent him back to talk to the woman in Portage-la-Prairie who had been getting drought yields without inputs. He'd dismissed the reports for 2 years before he could no longer dismiss the numbers. He found Wren in the machine shed, rinsing the aerator's air stones in a bucket of dilute vinegar. She looked up when his car door closed, said nothing, waited. "Miss Collier," he said. He stood in the doorway, the way a man stands when he hasn't been invited in and isn't sure he will be. "I owe you an apology. I was wrong about your system, the yields you're getting, the soil health data that's coming out of the provincial extension now. It confirms what you've been doing out here." He paused. "I'm sorry I discouraged you." Wren set the air stone down on a clean cloth, She looked at him for a moment, not unkindly but without hurry. "What is it you actually want, Mr. Doyle?" He had the grace to be slightly embarrassed. "We're developing a biological inputs line. Soil microbiome products, beneficial bacteria, liquid carbon amendments. We believe there's a significant market for it, and we think what you've built out here, the integrated fish and irrigation system, the aerator design, the margin-first approach, we think it could be packaged and licensed. You'd receive a royalty on every unit sold in the Prairie provinces. We'd handle the manufacturing, the distribution, the regulatory approval. You could go from 160 acres to influencing 1,000,000. Wren looked past him, through the open door of the machine shed, to where the Slough caught the October light. The grass carp were still in there, 8 years after she'd released them, having sorted themselves into a stable population that the Slough could support. The water was clear in the shallows and dark in the center where it was deepest. The cattails, cut back by the fish for years, had found a new equilibrium at the margins, and in their shadow the red-winged blackbirds still nested every spring as they had in her grandfather's time. "My grandfather never solved this problem," she said. "He died with it open. I solved it because I read his notebooks and took it seriously and had 30 years of his observations to stand on. That's not a product. That's a relationship between a person and a piece of land. The moment you put it in a package and sell it across the Prairie provinces, you've already missed the point." Mr. Doyle was quiet for a moment. He had a salesman's mind, trained to find the angle, and for once there was no angle to find. "So what do you want to do with it?" he asked. "I want to do what I'm doing," she said. "Farm it, improve it, write it down." She looked at him. "And show people who want to see it. That part's free." He stood there for a moment longer, then nodded, then walked back to his car. She watched the taillights disappear down the grid road, and then went back to the airstones. Now the story moves forward in the way that good Prairie stories always do, slowly, in increments, with the work visible in every increment. In 1995, Mr. Prentice's son took over the east section and drove over to ask Wren if she'd walk the slough with him. She did. She explained the system patiently, in the same voice she had used when she was a school teacher in Winnipeg explaining long division. She gave him copies of her soil data going back to 1988. He installed his own aerator in the dugout on his section the following spring. His yields improved over 4 years, not dramatically, but steadily, in the direction that meant something. In 1998, a journalist from the Winnipeg Free Press drove out to write a small feature on alternative prairie agriculture. The piece ran on a Tuesday, buried in the agricultural supplement, but it was read by enough people that Wren received 14 letters over the next 3 months. Farmers from Saskatchewan and Alberta, a few from the Peace River country in BC, one woman from a small farm outside Charlottetown, who wrote 4 careful pages in green ink about her own experiments with pond water and market garden beds. Wren answered every letter by hand. By 2002, the field margin that the Slough had fed for 15 years had organic matter levels of 3.4%. The provincial baseline for that soil type was 1.1. She had not applied a single bag of synthetic fertilizer to that section of land in 15 years, and it was the most productive soil on her operation. She expanded her slough irrigation system to the North Quarter and began the slow process of soil recovery there. She was 50 years old by then, and her hair was going white at the temples, and her hands were calloused in the specific geography of a person who works outdoors in every kind of Manitoba weather. She still walked the slough every morning. She still crumbled the margin soil between her fingers, the way her grandfather had, and held it to her nose. It smelled the way it was supposed to smell, dark and complicated and alive. There is a young woman who comes out from Winnipeg twice a month now, Wren's neighbor's daughter, a second-year agronomy student named Caitlin, who found Wren through a professor who had heard about the portage operation. Caitlin asks good questions and writes the answers in a small notebook that is, without either of them remarking on it, the same size as Thomas Collier's original 3. Wren takes her around the slough and shows her the water clarity, the fish population, the margin soil, the furrows. She doesn't lecture, she demonstrates. She has Caitlin take a soil sample from the treated margin and a sample from the untreated back field and bring them both to her nose. Which one smells like something? Wren asks. Caitlin holds the dark margin soil up, and her expression changes in a way that means she understands without needing to be told. In the farmhouse, on the desk that was her grandfather's desk, the 3 original notebooks sit in a stack. Beside them is a second stack. 17 notebooks now, in the same brown cover, filled in Wren's own hand. Soil readings, water chemistry, fish population counts, yield records, rainfall, temperature, the number of earthworms per square foot in the treated margin, the height of the cattails, the date the blackbirds arrived each spring, a 40-year conversation with a piece of land conducted in the language her grandfather began, and she continued, patient as the water, careful as the soil, certain of nothing except that the land keeps the score, and that if you feed it honestly, it will remember. The men with the company jackets and the clipboard looked at her grandfather's fields and saw a yield problem. They saw inputs and outputs, deficits and corrections. They offered her debt and called it help. Wren looked at the same fields and heard her grandfather's question. She took it seriously. She answered it with fish and water and patience and 30 years of careful watching. They told her the system couldn't work. They told her the numbers didn't support it. They told her she was gambling with the only land she had. She was, and the land paid her back with interest. Not in a single dramatic season, but in the slow, compounding way of healthy things. Year by year, the soil deepened. Year by year, the margin grew. Year by year, the slough kept producing what no bag of nitrogen had ever thought to offer, a living system cycling forward, fed by its own abundance, remembering everything.